Okay, welcome to the next screencast. This is on the labelling theory of crime. We're looking at whether or not crime is a social construct. We're going to hopefully learn this week that we're going to introduce the labelling theory of crime and deviance. We're going to be able to apply that labelling theory to examples of crime and deviance and evaluate the labelling theory, the pros, the cons, etc. Okay, firstly, the social construction of crime. What labelling theorists tend to look at is, instead of talking about crime being taken for granted, as we were discussing last week from Durkheim et al., labelling theorists are interested in how and why certain acts actually become to be deviant. So no act is actually deviant itself. What labelling theorists believe is that it's a social construct. So society tells us when something is deviant. Okay, Howard Becker, remember him from last year with the labelling theory in education? Well, he has an idea when it comes to crime as well. Howard Becker believes that by creating rules and applying them to particular people, that's when we label. Okay, so we're creating rules. This is right, this is wrong, and then social groups act in a certain way, and they fall either side of that line. So he believes that no act or person becomes deviant. It's the act that they're doing is labelled by other people. So society says what you've just done is bad. No one necessarily goes out and says, I want to act in a deviant way. It's society telling them that something's deviant. Okay, Becker also talks about these moral entrepreneurs. Okay, these are people, the good people, they're not bad people. Okay, we need to remember these are moral crusaders, as Becker calls them. They're actually wanting to change laws and put things in place to actually protect people. So these people who may be delinquents or whatever, they're actually making laws to try and benefit them. However, there's an issue with this. These new laws create a new group of outsiders. So again, fall on either side of these new laws that these moral crusaders are putting in place. And if you do break those rules, then you're seen as like an outlaw or a deviant. The second thing is that it actually creates or expands current social control. So if we have a police force or we have other forces which enforce these rules, they then impose these labels on people who don't act in the way that they're supposed to be. So Becker argues that we actually are in fact creating deviance because we are introducing these laws that are there to try and protect the exact people who are being deviant. Okay. Next thing we're going to look at is differential enforcement, and this is basically kind of a unequal society. Okay, so things aren't actually done equally, and that there are this racism and class issues, etc., when it comes to different types of enforcement of deviant behaviour. So the labelling theorists believe that the courts, the police, prosecutors, the government, etc., label certain groups as criminals. Okay, Pilivian and Breyer found that police made arrests based on how people looked, or the class, or the ethnicity, or the time and day. Okay, so we can see a lot of stuff like this happening in the news recently. Think about stop and search, people being pulled over and searched just because they're black and they wear a hoodie. So it happens, although this was done in 1964, this happens in modern day. Aaron Chickerell also did some studies, and interestingly the 1976 one suggested that justice was actually negotiable. First of all, the 76 one, he studied American youth and saw that white people from white backgrounds were sometimes kind of given an offer other than going to prison. So they might be asked for like help, or they'll go into counselling or psychiatric treatment or something like that, whereas people from mainly black people would be just sent to prison for exactly the same offence. Police use their stereotypes when stopping people, so black, low-income areas, things like that. Anyone who fit within the criteria that this police had in their stereotypical thoughts about what a deviant person looked like. And also, when they were arrested, you were more likely to be charged than a middle-class juvenile if you were from a lower-class area. So in conclusion, Chickerell's conclusion is that delinquents are produced by the agencies of society rather than the kids themselves. So it's not necessarily about your background in terms of your parents. It's more about the colour of your skin, the area you're from, and the stereotypical view that those social control agencies, such as the police, have over you. Moving on a bit further, what we draw from Chickerell studies is that official crime statistics don't necessarily tell us the whole story, and they can't be used as fact. As discussed last week, a lot of lower class crimes won't necessarily be reported, and also we have to take into account the stereotyping by police agencies, and there's a bias towards arresting certain type of people. We should investigate the whole process and not necessarily just the facts and figures. So we need to look at, the way that the police go about recording these statistics, the way that the police find criminals, or so-called criminals, inverted commas, and this will actually help us understand how official crime statistics are actually brought about. And it definitely highlights inequality. Something I want you to think about with Chickerell's study, okay, it uses participants and non-participant observations. Think about the research methods last year. So he's sitting in a police car and he's watching the police going around and taking offenders, and he's also sitting in the courtrooms and watching courtroom proceedings. He kind of took on a role of an unpaid probation officer, so a bit undercover, to gain a first-hand experience. I want you to think about that method and maybe come up with some conclusions about what's good and what's bad about using participant and non-participant observation. Okay, now we're going to look at the effects of labelling. We've looked at why people might be labelled, and how bad it can be and how stereotypical and biased it can be, but obviously it has a major impact on those who are being labelled. There's this idea that if you are labelled as a criminal, then you are more likely to act in a deviant way, and you're more likely to become so. So if you think back to self-fulfilling prophecy, we're going to look at that a little bit in a moment, but if you think back to last year, if you told you that you're thick, you think, well, what's the point? And you're gonna act out as being thick. So Edwin Lemire theorized that we have a primary and a secondary deviance. Okay, so primary deviance is where an act is not actually publicly labelled as deviant. So if you jump the metro or something like that, for instance, and you're not caught, then it's not really seen as being a deviant act, especially if you don't think it's deviant yourself. You probably think it might be deviant if you get caught, but if you get away with it, then you think, well, that's all right. It's not an issue. Or if you steal a pen from work or something like that. Secondary deviance, however, is a result of the reaction of society. So if someone is labelled as an offender, then they're excluded from society, they're victimised, they're pointed at, etc., etc. And others see the offender solely in terms of the label, so you can't shake that label off. So you're no longer a father or a neighbour or a friend. You're now seen as the thief or the fraudster or the murderer or whatever it is, okay? And then it kind of controls your identity. Then you become that person, you become that thief, and you act in a certain way. So as I've just said, self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you're labelled in this way, then it actually creates this idea in your head, the self-concept of, well, if this is what I am, this is what I might as well do. And that leads on to the secondary deviance, where you're thinking, well, if I'm a thief, then I may as well act like a thief. And that means that you're not actually rehabilitating. You are going to remain a thief for the rest of your life, because that is what you become, that's what you know, that's what society expects of you, and that leads you into joining this subculture, this deviant subculture, which offers support. So you're going to find support from people who are like you. So drug takers, for instance, if you're seen as like a dropout from society, you might take up drug taking, and then to fit in and not to feel as bad, you're going to find people who are very similar to you. Deviance amplification. It sounds like a very grand term, okay, but this is basically where it's kind of like a spiral, and it's the process where by trying to control a deviant person or a deviant act, it actually makes it worse. So it increases it rather than decreases it. So for instance, you could talk about prison being an example of deviance amplification. If you go into prison, you're going to learn from other prisoners, and you might learn to be a better thief or whatever it is, and get into that kind of thing. So it's similar to secondary deviance in that society's reacting, and it leads you on to acting in a certain way, but it makes you even more determined to be a thief or a drug addict or whatever it is. So you're thinking, well, society thinks this anyway, I'm going to show society, I'm going to really go for it here. So if you think about it, and it is ironic that these processes that are put in place to try and control social order and law-abiding citizens, in fact, produces the very opposite. It actually makes people kick up against the system and actually become more deviant. So these failed attempts to try and control, deviant acts has obviously failed quite a bit. It's having the opposite effect. So it adds weight to the argument that we're pushing people towards a deviant career by adding labels to them. So Triplett, in a US study that he conducted in De Haan in Holland, found that increasing controls have an adverse effect. So the more controls and things that you put on people, the more likely they are to have to offend, especially in the young. De Haan did quite a bit of study in Holland, and it is actually on the young people, and it's actually, it shows that we are creating the society of offenders by having so many controls. People are kicking against these controls. So the suggestion is, if we to reduce deviance, when it kind of like break it up and have fewer laws. I don't know what you think. I would like us to come to the lesson with that idea in your head about, should we have actually less laws? Would that make any difference? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? How would you feel about that as a law-abiding citizen as well? So what about when we, the opposite? So if we try to reintegrate people into society, how does that work? So if we're not necessarily punishing them, or if we have punished them, we try to reintegrate them in. John Braithwaite identifies there's positive roles that we can actually play, and that labeling sometimes can have a positive role. So we can distinguish between two types of what is called reintegrative shaming, which is negative labeling. So crime and the criminal labelled as bad, and the offenders normally excluded from society. So that's disintegration. So we are not wanting to integrate them. We're saying, no, they're really bad. However, reintegration, we kind of label people as, although they've done a bad thing or they're not a bad person, it's the act that they've done. So you can imagine, I'm sure you've seen in the news or whatever, people say, oh, this is so out of character for them to do this. They're not like that. They're a really nice person. So that's people trying to label the act as opposed to the individual. And I'm sure that's what would happen if someone within your family committed a crime. You might think differently. You know the person from a very young age, or you know them very well. You might think that's very out of character. So reintegration is needed, and so we shame the act, not the actual individual, as opposed to the other way. Braithwaite argues that this actually lowers crime in society. So pro-integration, we will lower crime, and it reduces the amount of secondary deviance, so the likelihood of someone wanting to commit a crime because they've been labelled as a criminal. So evaluating this label theory, positives, it shows laws not fixed. It's not a set fixed rules that we can take for granted, and it's something that's constructed, and that can be explained through its construction. It shows that crime statistics are more of a record of the activity as opposed to the criminal. So we need to take official crime statistics a little bit less on merit. It also shows that controlling deviant behaviour actually backfires. It creates more of a deviant society. Negatives, though, it focuses very much on lower class crime. So again, similar to what we were discussing last week, there's not much on upper class, middle class crime. Doesn't explain why crime is actually committed. It sees the offender as a kind of a victim, which is quite bad, I think. It ignores the real victims of the crime. It sees the criminal as the victim. It implies that without labeling, deviance wouldn't exist. As you can see, there's others. what I want you to do for next week is come with some ideas about how we can develop this further, and we'll look at subcultures.